In this chapter, we're going to talk about the link between money, interest rates, and exchange rates. So if you think about a previous video, we've talked about the effect that exchange rates have on, or the effect on exchange rates of changes in the interest rate and expected future exchange rates. So this will be an extension of that. And we're going to focus on how interest rates are determined and then look at the impact that that has on how expectations about future exchange rates are going to be determined. So let's start by just kind of reviewing a few things that you already know. If we think about money, then we can think about, in a principles of macro class, you would talk about the functions of money. Money serves as a medium of exchange. It serves as a unit of account, and it serves as a store of value. And money is the most liquid of all assets. There are a variety of assets that you can choose to store your purchasing power in to save for the future. And some of them are very illiquid, like a house, real estate. Takes time to sell. It takes time to convert it into the medium of exchange. So it's not liquid, but money is the medium of exchange. So it is the most liquid of all assets. If we think about what is money, we can think about currency and bank deposits. Currency and bank deposits. So money that is in demand deposits, checking account. We can think about the way that the Federal Reserve measures the amount of money, and we talk about a measure that the Fed uses called M1. It's the most liquid of money, most liquid category of money. There's also M2. M2 includes everything that's in M1, plus some categories of assets that are a little less liquid than M1, but are still very liquid. So for example, dollars that are stored in a savings account, even though you can't typically use your debit card to access those, you would be able to, in no time, transfer them into your checking account and then be able to access them with your debit card. So M1 is the most liquid category. M2 includes all of that, plus a few things that are a little less liquid. We're going to think about the money supply as being controlled by the Fed. Now we know, hopefully you remember from your principles of macro class or an intermediate macro class, that the Fed has some tools that it uses to control the money supply. So it uses open market operations. The most commonly used tool that the Fed has, open market operations. It can change the reserve requirement. It doesn't do this very often. And then it can change the discount rate. It does occasionally do that. So those are the three tools that they have, but remember that the job of the Fed in controlling the money supply is made more complicated by the fact that bank lending also changes the money supply, and the Fed doesn't have any control over bank lending. Another thing that changes the money supply is the amount of money that households choose to actually keep in a demand deposit. If households, instead of keeping money in a demand deposit, like a checking account, kept it in their pockets or in a mason jar buried in their backyard, then that impact, if people start pulling their money out of the banking system, that changes the money supply, and the Fed doesn't have any control over that. What we're going to do in this chapter is we're going to pretend as if the Fed has complete control over it. We know in reality that that's not true, but it's a good place to start. So let's talk about a model that you've already probably discussed in previous classes, previous macro classes, and that would be the money demand, money supply model. So let's think about the things that determine the amount of money that households demand or that an individual chooses to hold. So if we think about money demand, we can think about the demand for any asset, and the demand for any asset is going to be determined by a handful of things. The first one is going to be the expected return of that asset. That's going to be an important determinant of whether or not you choose to hold an asset, is your expectation about its future return. If we think about how the demand for money is impacted by the interest rate, the more money that you choose to hold, the less you're able to take advantage of higher interest rates. So the higher the interest rate, the less money you're going to choose to hold, and vice versa. The lower the interest rate, the more money you're going to choose to hold. So an increase in the interest rate is going to cause a decrease in the quantity demanded of money. Let's just write that out. Increase in the interest rate is going to cause a decrease in quantity demanded of money. So that's the first thing that goes into your demand for an asset. The second one, we can talk about risk. Different assets have different amounts of risk. In terms of money demand, this isn't a very important one. So we don't really need to think too much about this as long as we're talking about money demand. Let's go to the third one, and that's liquidity. So your demand for a particular asset is going to be determined in part by the liquidity of that asset. How fast can you turn it into the medium of exchange? And money is the most liquid of all assets. So we can think about an increase in the amount of transactions that a household needs to make is going to lead to an increase in quantity demanded of money. And vice versa, a decrease in the number of transactions that a household needs to make would decrease the quantity demanded of money. So now let's think about aggregate money demand. So we're going to think about aggregate. We're going to think about the total amount of money demanded in the economy. And this would simply be the sum of all of the household demands for money and firm demands for money. Firms hold some money also. So we could just say this is the sum of the individual money demands. And this is the one that we're going to be thinking about, individual money demands. So let's think about the three things that go into determining aggregate money demand. Summarize them. We can think about the interest rate. And the way that works is, of course, that we've got it up here. An increase in the interest rate is going to lead to a decrease in the quantity demanded of money. We can think about the price level. And the way that works is that the higher the price level, the higher the demand for money. Higher the price level, higher the demand for money. Because you need to use money to make transactions. And the higher the price level, the more dollars you need to engage in those transactions. And then we can think about national income, let's say real national income. GDP. The higher the national income, the higher the demand for money. So let's put it right here. Higher income it's going to lead to higher demand for money. So we can write a general form for our money demand. Let's write it this way. We're going to say money demand is going to be a function of the price level. I'm going to put it out here by itself, multiplied by this general function I'm going to call L, which is going to be a function of the interest rate and income. So let's identify the things that we've got here. P is going to be our price level. R is going to be the interest rate. and y is going to be real GDP or gross national product. So the textbook that we're using calls it gross national product. You could think about it as GDP, it doesn't matter. So let's think about summarizing how these impacts work. So an increase in the price level is going to have a positive impact on money demand. An increase in income is going to have a positive effect on it, but an increase in the interest rate is going to have a negative impact on it, because if the interest rate goes up, you're going to want to hold less money and hold your purchasing power in other assets with higher rates of return. So we add the price level here multiplicatively, because what we know is that the price level is going to have proportional changes in the amount of money that you need to hold. A doubling of the price level means that you need twice as much money as before. So that enters multiplicatively up here. Typically what we do is we talk about real money demand. And so what we're going to do is, if we divide by the price, we can say that money demand divided by the price level, which we would call real money demand, is a function of the interest rate and real income. So this right out here, this is our aggregate real money demand. And this is really just a demand for liquidity. That's why we put this L out here. So if we were to summarize graphically the relationship here, here's how we're going to be thinking about this. We've got our interest rate up here. And again, you've seen this before. You would have seen a simpler version of this in a Principles of Macro class, and probably you might have seen exactly this in an intermediate macro class. You would have reviewed it. So down here we've got the quantity demanded of money. Let's put it. And we've got this money demand curve, which is just a demand for liquidity. So the higher the interest rate, we graph this thing with the interest rate on our vertical axis. The higher the interest rate, the lower the amount of money that you want to hold, and lower the interest rate, the higher the amount of money that you want to hold. And then your demand for money is going to be influenced by the real rate of return and by income. So now what we need to do is add the money supply in here. So I'm going to clear this off, and then we'll take a look at adding money supply and see how the interest rate is determined. Okay, so we've got our money demand picture here. Let's add our money supply. We want to talk about equilibrium in the money market, so let's add the money supply. The money supply is going to be determined by the Fed, and it's not going to be a function of the interest rate. And so we're going to use MS to stand for the money supply, but we're going to be thinking about the real money supply. So we're going to have it divided by the price. Okay, so we've got real money supply. Let's write that up here. Here's our real money supply. And of course, you know that the intersection of the real money supply and real money demand is going to give us the interest rate. Let's call it R star. So if we were to think about why the interest rate is going to go to R star, we could think about maybe a higher interest rate. So if we thought about an interest rate that was up here, then we would see that the quantity supplied of money is higher than the quantity of money that people want to hold. And so people are going to want to lend their money out. They don't want to hold as much. The problem is people aren't going to want to borrow it at that high interest rate. And so in order to induce people to borrow money from them, those people who want to lend are going to offer a lower interest rate. And so that excess supply of money is going to put downward pressure on the interest rate until we get to R star, where there's no excess demand or excess supply for money. There's no surplus or shortage. So it works exactly like every other demand-supply picture that you've thought about. So now let's think about the relationship between interest rates and the money supply. So if we were to start, let's Let's draw another smaller picture down here. If we were to start, we've got our interest rate, we've got our money demand, there's quantity of money. Let's put our money supply right here. So let's call this MS, we'll call it M1 for money supply 1. And let's put our price level down there. Here's our initial real interest rate. We'll call it R1. So if we think about what happens if we have an increase in the money supply, then if we start here at point 1, let's call it point A. If we start at A and we have an increase in the money supply, so let's say we have an increase in money supply from M1 to M2. I always tell my classes, don't get confused by this M1 here. This is not the same M1 as what we're talking about when we talk about the official measure that the Fed uses of the money supply. I'm using my 1 and 2 here to indicate a sequence of money supply amounts. So this is simply where we start and then we move to M2. Okay, so if we think about an increase in the money supply, our money supply curve is going to shift to the right. We move from point A to point B. So here's our new money supply, M2 over the price level. And we're going to end up with a lower interest rate down here at R2. So an increase in the money supply is going to drive that interest rate down. Let's think about what happens if we change output. What happens if we change real GDP? If we do a similar thing, we've got our money demand here, money supply. So let's call that M. I'm not going to change the money supply, so I'll just call it M over P. Here's our initial interest rate, R1. We start at point A. Here's our money demand. It's a function of the interest rate and income. We're going to change income, so let's call that Y1. So if we start with output level Y1, gross domestic product or gross national product at Y1, then we can think about the impact that an increase in incomes is going to have. If we increase income, then this money demand curve is going to shift to the right. So this would now be the demand for liquidity or the demand for money. Right down here, remember, this is the quantity of money. This would be now at this higher income, we've got demand at Y2, then we're going to have upward pressure on that interest rate and it's going to drive it up to R2. So we have an increase in income, that's going to drive up the interest rate. So this is a model that you've seen before. And what we want to do now is link this up with the exchange rate model that we talked about in a previous video. And remember that exchange rate model had interest rate there, and that interest rate is going to be the link between that model that we talked about then and this model now. So let's talk about the relationship between money supply and the exchange rate. Here we've got the relationship between money supply and the real rate of return. In our previous video, we talked about the relationship between the real rate of return and the exchange rate. So we can link these together. So if we think about what that model looked like, let's kind of review what we did there. Remember, we had the exchange rate, the dollar, we were using the dollar-euro exchange rate. We had down here the real rate of return, and we have to, once we start adding two currencies in here, we have to be careful about which rate of return. This was the dollar rate of return. And what we had was the expected euro rate of return. Let me write what that thing looked like. So I'm going to kind of sneak it in right down here. What that thing looked like was this. It was the euro rate of return plus the expected depreciation of the dollar against the euro. So it was plus, in our numerator we had the expected exchange rate minus the current exchange rate divided by the current exchange rate. This was dollars over euros for each one of these. I'm not going to write it because it would get too tight down there. So this is our expected euro rate of return. Let's just write that. Expected euro return. And then we had right down here the dollar rate of return. And so we took a look at what happens if the rate of return in terms of dollars increases or decreases. We saw what happened in terms of the exchange rate. Right out here is our equilibrium exchange rate. Call it E star. That's the dollar to euro exchange rate. We saw how that exchange rate changed if the interest rate increased or decreased. Then we talked about what happened if the euro rate of return increased or decreased, or we talked about what happened if expectations about future exchange rate went up or down. And we saw the impact that that had on the current exchange rate. So what we want to do now is we want to combine these models. This model has the interest rate up here. This model has the interest rate down here. What we can do is we can take this picture, turn it on its side, bring it down here and stick it right down here below this picture, and we'll be then able to understand the link between the money supply in a country and the exchange rate. So I'm going to clear this off and then we'll start over there with that model. All right, so let's put this together. I'm going to draw one long axis down here. I'm going to divide this up into two. And the link between our two models is the real rate of return, this dollar rate of return. On our vertical, or our top picture here, our vertical axis, we're going to have the exchange rate, the dollar-euro exchange rate. And then down here, what we've got in this picture is we've got that money market picture turned on its side. So down here, this is the quantity of money. So if you think about this picture kind of at a 45-degree angle, our money demand curve looked like that. It was downward sloping. That one was the demand for liquidity, demand for money. Then we had the money supply curve, and remember that one was vertical, but when we turn it on its side, it's going to be horizontal like this. So there's our money supply. We'll call it real money supply. And then up here, we've got that expected euro return curve that looks like this. It's downward sloping, expected euro return. And right here is going to be the real interest rate. We'll call it R. Let's put our dollar sign there because it's the dollar rate of return. And that's where this curve is vertical. Right? That's our dollar return that you would get on dollars. And so wherever our money supply is, here's the real money supply. The intersection of money supply and money demand determines the dollar rate of return. And then the intersection of the dollar rate of return and the expected euro rate of return determines the exchange rate, the dollar to euro exchange rate. So now we've got our dollar-euro exchange rate. So we've now got this model where we can start with the money supply. We can think about what happens to the money supply. We can think about what that does to the real rate of return in terms of dollars. And then we can think about what that ends up doing or resulting in terms of the dollar to euro exchange rate. So let's kind of draw out a little map of what's going on. There are things that can be happening in the U.S. economy in terms of the U.S. money supply, but remember there's also the European money market with the European central banks and what they could be doing to the money supply over there. So if we think about what happens, we could put together kind of a little picture over here. We could think about the Fed, the U.S. Fed, the U.S. Federal Reserve. The U.S. Fed is going to determine the money supply, so they're going to pick the money supply in the U.S. And through the money market, we've got the U.S. money market, which is this picture. Depending upon what the Fed determines the money supply to be, that's going to determine the real rate of return in terms of dollars. We've also got the same thing going on in terms of the European system. So if we think about the European system of central banks, we could just say central banks in Europe. They're going to be determining the money supply. We can think about the money supply. Let's just call it the money supply. Let's put an E down there for Europe. And then we'll think about what happens in the European money markets. There's going to be if we group Europe together as one economic unit, then we can think about a picture like this for what's happening in Europe. And so this would be the European money market. And so the intersection of the money supply and money demand in that European money market is going to determine the euro rate of return. And then we know that the euro and the dollar rate of return interact with each other over in this market. So right here we've got the foreign exchange market. And so what comes out of the foreign exchange market, of course, then is this exchange rate, the dollar to euro exchange rate, or we could view it from Europe's perspective, the euro to dollar exchange rate would be the inverse of that, but here would be the dollar to euro exchange rate. So this gives you kind of a map of what's going on here. We've got this side of it drawn right here, but there's a similar thing that's going to be happening in terms of Europe's money supply. So let's think about now with this model that we've got developed here, let's think about what happens when we change the money supply in the U.S. And let's just kind of work through the result that's going to end up with in terms of the exchange rate. So let me clear this off and then we'll do that. All right, so we've got a picture of this model that we're working with. We're starting with equilibrium in our money market down here, and then we're talking about, we've got let's put our real rate of return, our initial dollar rate of return, R1. That leads us to equilibrium in the foreign exchange market, where we've got an initial exchange rate at E1 right up here. So now let's think about what happens when we change the money supply. So I've got my initial real money supply here identified with M1. Let's suppose that the Fed increases the money supply to M2. So our money supply curve is going to shift down here. Our money supply is going to increase. Always think about that picture on its side. So we've got our money supply M2, real money supply. That's going to lead us to a new equilibrium down here in the money market. It's going to decrease the rate of return. We saw that in our previous picture. So we get a lower real rate of return. We'll call it R2. Interest rate declines. That shifts our dollar return to the left. So this thing moves to the left here. Of course, let's put our new equilibrium down here. It's at 0.2. Our equilibrium in the money market is not going to be at 0.1 now. We've got a new equilibrium up here. That's going to cause the exchange rate to rise to E2. This is our dollar-euro exchange rate. So the dollar depreciates. The other way to look at that is that the euro appreciates. What's happening here is that the dollar price of buying a euro is going up. So the dollar is getting weaker. So our general conclusion here is that an increase in a country's money supply causes its currency to depreciate. That's important. Increase in a country's money supply causes its currency to depreciate. That results in a depreciation of its currency. And of course, the opposite would be true. A decrease in a country's money supply would cause an appreciation of its currency. Let's think about what would happen if we had a change in the European money supply. Let's think about what impact that would have on the exchange rate. So let's kind of reproduce this picture here. We've got our real rate of return. We've got our exchange rate up here, dollar to euro exchange rate. Let's put down here our money supply and the demand for money. We're not going to change the money supply in the U.S., so we can just call that M over P. Here's our money demand. And we've got an initial real rate of return of R1. Now up in this picture, our dollar rate of return looks like that. It's vertical, dollar return. And then we've got this expected euro return. And let's write out, I'm going to have to kind of squeeze this into a small amount of space, but let's write out what that expected euro rate of return looks like. Remember, that's the European return. And we have to add to that the expected appreciation or depreciation of the dollar. Now, we know that what's happening in the European money market looks like what's going to be happening in the U.S. money market. And what we've just seen here is that an increase in the money supply is going to drive the rate of return down. Well, here's the European rate of return, so an increase in their money supply is going to drive that European rate of return down. So it's going to be this that's going to change. Let's call that R1. Let's go ahead and identify point 1. This is where we start. Right, here's our exchange rate, dollar to euro exchange rate. We'll call it E1 because that's where we start. So if the money supply changes in Europe, that's not going to have any impact down here. What ends up happening is this expected euro rate of return is going, or euro return is going to decrease. So we get a downward shift of this thing. So this one is going to be R2. That's the euro return plus the expected appreciation or depreciation, the dollar. So this thing decreases. We get a new equilibrium here at point 2. And that leads us to a lower exchange rate. That's the dollar to euro exchange rate. So we see exactly this same thing, except what's happening here is that the European money supply is increasing. If the European money supply, if we think about Europe again as an economic unit, an increase in Europe's money supply causes a depreciation of the dollar. The exchange rate decreases, which is a depreciation of the euro. Okay, that is an appreciation of the dollar. So we're just looking, essentially, this is what happens when we change the U.S. Money supply. Here's what happens if we were to change the European money supply. So you can see that the exact same thing happens. This is an important result to remember right there. So now let's think about what happens in terms of the difference between the short run and the long run. So what we know from basic macro theory is that changes in the money supply can have short-run impacts but are not going to have long-run impacts. So if we have an increase or decrease in the money supply, that will have no effect on, say, long-run values of real interest rates or real output. Remember, we have this classical dichotomy where you can divide economic variables into those that are nominal units or denominated in nominal terms, dollar terms, and then there are real measures, things like real GDP versus nominal GDP. And so a change in the price level will affect nominal measures but won't affect real measures. So one of the basic things that you know is that if you simply double, say, the money supply, then all prices are going to double. And in terms of all prices doubling, that has no impact on real measures. So the example I use in a class, and I think we've talked about this example in this class before, is that if you have, let's say, $100 of income and an ice cream cone costs $2, then you can buy 50 ice cream cones. Well, if we change the nominal measures, let's suppose now you have $200 of income and an ice cream cone costs $4. So we doubled both of those. We doubled your nominal income. Problem is we also doubled prices. Your real income is still 50 ice cream cones. So that doubling of the price level there had no impact on your real income. At the beginning you could buy 50 ice cream cones, and at the end you can buy 50 ice cream cones, and that's what matters. So if we think about, say, full employment output, full employment output is going to be determined by an economy's endowment of labor and capital. It's going to be determined by technology. It's not going to be determined by the money supply. If we think about interest rates, we've talked about the need to convert a nominal interest rate into a real interest rate. You have to subtract off the inflation rate to get your real rate of return. A change in the money supply will affect nominal interest rates. And of course, a change in the money supply is going to cause inflation or deflation, depending upon whether the money supply goes up or down. But a change in the money supply is not going to affect real rates of return. So the conclusion that we can think about here is that a permanent increase in the money supply simply causes a proportional change in the price level, at least in the long run. Let's think about what that means in terms of exchange rates, because in a Principles of Macro class, you probably didn't think about the impact that that's going to have on exchange rates. So if we think about, let's use as an example, let's suppose that the U.S. issues a new currency, brand new currency, and one new dollar is equal to 2 old dollars. Then we can think about what impact that's going to have on the exchange rate. Let's suppose the exchange rate was, this is going to be our dollar to euro exchange rate. If the exchange rate was $1.20 per euro, so the exchange rate starts out, you've got to pay $1.20 per euro. Then if we have a new dollar that's issued where each new dollar equals 2 old dollars, the new exchange rate, as you can probably guess, is going to be 0.60. This is in terms of old dollars. This is in terms of new dollars. So a change in the money supply has a very similar impact on exchange rates as what we see in terms of the price level in an economy. If we were to cut the money supply in half, then we would see that each dollar is going to be worth twice as much as before. Doubling the money supply makes each dollar worth half as much as before. Cutting the money supply in half makes each dollar worth twice as much as it used to be. So it's going to lead to a proportional appreciation or depreciation of the dollar against the euro. What we know is that that's going to lead to a proportional change in the prices of all goods and services, and the relative prices of U.S. goods and services and foreign goods and services isn't going to change. So our general conclusion from that is that a permanent increase in a country's money supply causes a proportional long-run depreciation of its currency against foreign currencies. So what we need to do now is think about the impact that that's going to have in terms of this picture. And what we're going to see is that there's going to be something interesting that happens to our exchange rate. So if we have a change in the money supply, we're going to observe changes in the exchange rate. But one of the things that we tend to see in the real world with exchange rates is that they tend to be pretty volatile. They tend to move rapidly. And so we need to think about what causes that, and there's a good theoretical explanation for why that would happen. So I'm going to clear this off and then we'll take a look at that. All right, let's think now about the short-run and long-run impacts of a permanent change in the money supply. So we're going to think about an increase in the money supply, but you could do all of this backwards with a decrease in the money supply. But what we're going to think about is a permanent change in the money supply, not an increase and then a decrease. So I'm going to draw one picture here that's going to identify the short-run impacts of this change in the money supply. And then we're going to think about over here another set of pictures where we've got the long-run impact. So let's start by drawing our model of the money market and the foreign exchange market. Here we've got our real rate of return. We've got our dollar to euro exchange rate. Down here we've got US dollars, quantity of money. And so we've got our money demand curve down here. Remember, this is the demand for liquidity. We've got our money supply. I'm going to draw, we're going to increase the money supply, so I don't want to put it too far down here. I'm going to start it right up here. So here's our money supply. Let's call it money supply M1. That's where we're going to start. And we're going to identify the initial price level. Call it P1. Because what we're going to see, we know if the money supply changes, the price level is going to change. So we're going to start there. We're going to identify our initial starting point at point 1. Of course, that determines the real rate of return in terms of dollars. We'll call it R1. And then up here in our money market picture, or excuse me, our foreign exchange picture, we've got our dollar return. And then we've got our expected euro return. Now, what we're going to see here is that our euro return, expected euro return is going to increase. So I'm going to draw it kind of down here so that we start with an initial intersection right there. So here's our expected euro return. I'm going to also identify my initial starting point here as point 1, and right over here is going to be my initial exchange rate, E1. That's our dollar-euro exchange rate. So we're going to be starting at point 1 in both pictures. Initial money supply here at M1. Let's think about what happens if the money supply increases. So let's increase the money supply. Now, immediately when that happens, the price level is not going to change. So we're going to have an increase in the money supply to M2, but the initial price level is still going to be what it is. So again, you have to think about this picture on its side. We get this increase in the money supply. Our new equilibrium now is going to be here at point 2. that's going to drive down the real rate of return, the dollar rate of return. So our real rate of return in terms of dollars is going to fall to R2. That shifts our dollar return curve to the left. But now I'm not going to identify my equilibrium because that's not going to be where the equilibrium actually is. Because the money supply is permanent, that increase in the money supply, people expect it to be permanent, they're going to change their expectations about the exchange rate. And so people's expectations about future exchange rates will rise. Remember, an increase in the money supply drives up the exchange rate. Well, if that increase in the money supply is permanent, it's also going to drive up people's expectations about the exchange rate in the future. And remember, that is part of what went into this expected euro rate of return. Remember, it was the euro interest rate, R, plus the expected appreciation of the dollar or depreciation of the dollar. That expected exchange rate was in that term, and so our expected euro return is going to increase. We're going to move to a new equilibrium right up here at point 2. So two things are happening in this foreign exchange picture. The increase in the money supply is going to be driving down the dollar rate of return, but it's also driving up the expected euro rate of return. So our new current exchange rate is going to be right up here. There's our dollar to euro exchange rate currently. Okay. So that's going to be, let's identify this as the short run. This is the short run impact of a permanent increase in the money supply. What we want to do now is think about what's going to happen in the long run. Because in the long run, our price level is going to change. So let's put over here the long run impact. I'm going to try to get things to match up here. So I've got to be kind of deliberate with how I draw this. So I want to start in this picture from point 2. Okay? So what we've got over here, we've got our money supply right here, our money demand right here. Here's our money supply, M2 over P1. That gives us our dollar rate of return. I meant to call that R2 to match up with that R2. So we've got our dollar return right up here. And we've got that expected euro rate of return, this one right here. We're going to put, and we're going to be starting with the exchange rate E2. So right there's where our expected euro return is going through. So essentially in this picture, I'm starting from point 2 in that picture. Okay. So now we need to think about what happens in terms of the long run. Remember, here's our quantity of money, and let's identify this as the long run. So in the long run, the price level is going to adjust in response to this change in the money supply. So as the price level adjusts, remember the price level adjusts proportionally to how much the money supply was increased. If the money supply had been doubled, the price level will double. Well, when the price level adjusts, then the new ratio of the money supply to the new price level is going to be right back here. If we double the money supply and the price level doesn't change, then this ratio changes. It's going to move down here. It's going to double. But then when the price level also doubles, this is going to move back. So in the long run, we're going to have a new ratio here of M2 over P2. And it's going to be exactly equal to M1 over P1. Okay? So in the long run, this money supply, real money supply schedule shifts right back where it started. And so we get a new rate of return, real dollar rate of return of R3. Let's call this new point 0.3 right there. That means our dollar rate of return shifts back to the right, and we get a new equilibrium up here at 0.3. And this R3 is going to also be equal to R1. Remember, all that's happened in this picture is that our real money supply curve initially shifted down, and then it shifted right back. So R3 is equal to R1. If we look at what ends up happening up here in our foreign exchange market, we get a new exchange rate of E3. And that new exchange rate, because our expected euro rate of return has shifted to the right, that new exchange rate is going to be higher than where it started. Okay? So E3, this is the dollar to euro exchange rate. E3 ends up being higher than where the exchange rate started. So let's think about what we're seeing here. What happens is when you have a permanent increase in the money supply, what we tend to see is in the short run the exchange rate jumps up, and then over the longer time horizon, over the long run, it jumps up initially and then goes back down. So we tend to see these jumps in the exchange rate. Either they jump up and then kind of go back down, or they jump down and go back up. So what we're observing here is a good theoretical explanation for why we tend to see a lot of volatility in the exchange rate. Because a change in a country's money supply, if it's perceived as being permanent, will cause the exchange rate to overshoot where it's going to end up. It's going to jump up high. It's going to then kind of decline in the long run back to its long run equilibrium level. We tend to call this exchange rate overshooting. Exchange rate overshooting. And again, it's an important explanation for why we see a lot of volatility in exchange rates. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of how we start with that money market model that you would have learned back in a Principles of Macro class, and how we can link that up to the foreign exchange market and think about how changes in a country's money supply, whether it happens in the U.S. or whether it happens in another country, how those changes end up impacting the exchange rate in both the short run and the long run. I will see you in another video.